Please, uncle. I don't want to marry now. I want to be a doctor. I have a future to build. Please. Do you think I will waste my money training a useless girl like you? Go pack your things. Uncle, please. Please. I don't want to marry that poor security man. Shut up. You don't have a choice in this matter. I won't marry him, she cried, her voice shaking like a leaf in a heavy storm. He is just a poor security guard. Watch your words, her uncle snapped, his eyes cold and sharp. The marriage is already settled. But uncle, she pleaded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I want to build a future. I want to study medicine and become a doctor. Enough. Her uncle barked, slamming his heavy hand on the table so hard the walls seemed to shake. Why should I waste money sending a useless girl like you to school? The room fell completely silent. Every person sitting there looked at Grace as if she were a piece of old furniture to be moved from one house to another. To them, she was not a young woman with a heartbeat in a dream. She was a problem, a burden, something to be solved quickly and cheaply. They married her off to the first man who asked, a man in tattered clothes they believed was a common watchman. But none of them knew that the man they were laughing at was the secret billionaire. The very man her uncle had been desperately begging for a business favor. Stay with me until the very end. Because the twist in this story, nobody saw it coming. Not even Grace. Her name was Grace. And she had been alone in this world since she was 7 years old. Both of her parents had died from a sickness that moved through the village quietly, like a fire nobody saw starting. She had no brothers, no sisters, only her Uncle Bernard, who had taken her and not out of love, but out of the patient, calculating hope that she would one day be useful to him in some way. That day had now arrived. For months, Bernard had been trying desperately to reach a wealthy businessman named Desmond, the founder of a powerful company rumored to be planning major investments in the region. Bernard wanted a contract, a deal, a handshake that would make him rich. But Desmond never replied to his letters, never returned his messages. To Bernard, Desmond was a ghost with a bank account, completely unreachable. What Bernard did not know was that Desmond had already found him. Desmond had a habit that almost nobody knew about. Whenever he traveled to a new place, he dressed in simple clothes, introduced himself as a security guard, and watched how people behaved when they believed no one important was present. He had been cheated, flattered, and manipulated too. Many times by people who changed completely the moment they discovered his wealth. He had learned that the truest version of any person only appeared when they thought the world was not watching. He had arrived in Grace's village 3 months before the marriage. One quiet evening, he had seen her sitting under a large tree near the river bend, a notebook open in her lap, carefully drawing the small pale flowers growing between the roots of 2 ancient trees. He watched her close the notebook, stand up, and walk slowly toward an elderly woman sitting alone outside a crumbling door. He watched Grace reach into her own small bag, pull out a small cloth pouch, and press it gently into the old woman's hands, her lips moving slowly and carefully, explaining how to use it. The old woman clutched the pouch to her chest like something precious. Desmond stood very still for a long time after Grace walked away. He had never seen anything quite like that. Not in all his years of watching people. When he quietly learned that Bernard was eager to marry off his niece as quickly as possible, Desmond made a calm, deliberate decision. He approached Bernard in his security guard clothes and offered a modest sum to arrange the marriage. Bernard, whose greed had always been louder than his good sense, saw the money and asked no serious questions. He never once stopped to wonder why a poor watchman had clean, quiet money to offer, or why a man in dusty clothes would want to pay to marry a girl he had barely met. The wedding was small and joyless on Grace's side. She stood through the ceremony with dry eyes because she had already cried everything she had in the 3 nights before. When it was over, she picked up the small bag containing everything she owned and followed her new husband home. The house was small. The roof had a patch near the corner that leaked when it rained hard, but it was clean. Desmond had made sure of that. That first night, they sat across from each other at a small wooden table with a single candle burning between them. The silence was not angry. It was simply the silence of two strangers trying to find where to begin. Desmond was the one who spoke first. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said quietly. "I want you to know that you are safe here. I will never raise my hand to you. I will never speak to you with cruelty. Whatever this is, we will carry it with respect." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. "I wanted to become a doctor," she said softly. It was not an accusation. It was simply the truest sentence inside her. "I know," Desmond said gently. "And I want you to know that wanting that does not make you foolish. It makes you someone worth listening to." She looked up at him slowly. "You do not even know me," she said. "Not yet," he said quietly. "But I would like to." Grace said nothing more that night, but something about those words settled differently in her chest than she expected. Not trust, not yet. But the smallest, most seal thread of something that was not quite hopelessness either. Life settled into a quiet rhythm. Desmond left early each morning in his security guard uniform and returned each evening just before dark. He never came home angry. He always greeted her the same way, stepping through the door and asking, "How was your day, Grace?" At first, she gave him short answers. Fine, quiet, nothing new. But slowly, the answers grew longer. Grace had found work as a cleaner at the nearest hospital 2 towns away. She woke before sunrise every morning and took the first bus out. She mopped floors and cleaned wards with her spine perfectly straight and her eyes always moving, reading everything around her as if the hospital itself were a textbook. Because to Grace it was, every evening she came home and sat at the table with a notebook open, reading borrowed medical books by the light of a small lamp, connecting everything she was learning to something she had carried in her heart since childhood, the silver bloom. It grew in only one place in the whole village, between the roots of 2 ancient trees near the river bend. It was small and pale and almost invisible unless moonlight touched it at just the right angle. Grace had discovered it at age 9 during a terrible fever. With no money for medicine and no adult willing to help, she had brewed it into a tea and woken 4 days later completely well. She had been carefully studying it ever since. Now, with medical knowledge growing inside her, she was beginning to understand what she had always only felt. The flower contained a natural compound with remarkable anti-inflammatory properties. If properly researched, it could treat serious conditions that currently cost families devastating amounts of money to manage. She knew the silver bloom was something the world did not yet know it needed, and she knew it had to be protected. About 2 months into the marriage, Desmond came home one evening quieter than usual. He sat at the table and said after a long pause that money was very short. He was sorry. He did not know when things would improve. Grace looked at him steadily across the table. "Is there food for tomorrow?" she asked. "Not much," he said, his eyes low. She reached into the lining of her bag and quietly placed a small envelope of coins she had been saving from her hospital wages on the table between them. Desmond looked at the envelope. Then he looked at her. "Grace, that is your money." "It is our money now," she said simply. Tomorrow. That is what matters." He opened his mouth and closed it again. Something moved across his face that he did not have the words for yet. The following week, Desmond came home looking pale and moving slowly, one hand pressed to his side. By the next morning, he was worse. Grace pressed her hand to his forehead. He was burning. She went to the hospital pharmacy after her shift and asked about the medicine. The price made her stomach drop. It was more than she had. She went straight to her supervisor. "I need a second shift," she said. Her supervisor looked at her carefully. "That is a very long day, Grace." "I know," she said. "I can do it." She worked double shifts for 4 straight days. Her feet HDHD, her back burned. She ate very little because every coin was going toward the medicine. On the 3rd night, sitting on the bus home in the deck, she rested her head against the window and let herself cry quietly, just for a few minutes, where no one could see. Then she wiped her face, straightened her back, and got off at her stop when she brought the medicine home and sat beside Desmond on the edge of the bed. He looked at her face for a long time. He could see everything she was not saying. "You work double shifts," he said softly. "You needed medicine," she replied, opening the packet. "Grace." His voice was barely above a whisper. She looked up. "Why?" he asked. Just that one word. She was quiet for a moment because when I stood in that ceremony and made a promise, she said carefully, "I decided that whether or not I chose this life, I was going to live it with my whole heart. That is who I am." Desmond was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Lower. As if something inside him had changed permanently. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met," he said. Grace handed him the medicine and told him quietly to drink it after eating. The weeks after Desmond recovered were different between them. Desmond began asking her about the silver bloom in the evenings. Simple questions at first. What does it smell like? How deep are the roots, then deeper ones? What exactly do you think it can treat? She would look up from her notebook with a small expression of surprise each time, as if she had not expected anyone to ask. Then she would explain carefully and he would listen with complete attention. One evening she caught him watching her mid-explanation with an expression she could not fully read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Keep going. You were talking about the compound in the petals." She narrowed her eyes. "You understand what a compound is?" she asked. "I read," he said simply, and looked back down at his book. Grace stayed at him for 3 full seconds. Then she went back to her notebook. She was beginning to understand that there was significantly more to this man than a dusty uniform and quiet evenings. Then the trouble arrived. One morning, men in expensive cars drove into the village and announced with polished smiles that a major company had purchased the hills at the edge of the village to build a luxury hotel. Villagers would receive a small payment and needed to leave within 60 days. Grace felt the air leave her body completely. The silver bloom grew on those hills. Every single plant. If construction began, it would be gone from the world forever. She spent 2 weeks preparing. She gathered samples, wrote detailed notes connecting the flower's properties to medical research, and built a careful, honest case for why those hills were worth infinitely more as a protected medicinal garden than as a hotel foundation. Then she formally requested a meeting with the company representatives. They agreed, half amused. They expected a brief conversation. Grace spoke for 40 minutes. Without stopping. She showed her samples, her research, her years of careful observation, and her calculations on what the silver bloom could mean for affordable medicine worldwide. When she finished, the room was completely silent. 2 representatives exchanged a look. They thanked her and said they would bring her findings directly to the company owner. What Grace still did not know was that Desmond had been monitoring the project from the beginning. When his team reported back about the young woman who had delivered a 40-minute case for a flower, he said nothing out loud. He simply nodded, and something behind his eyes went very warm and very quiet. He had already known she would do exactly that. 2 weeks later, a formal invitation arrived at their small house. A grand celebration dinner in the city. Grace's name was listed specifically as a featured guest. Bernard's name was on the list, too. He arrived at the dinner in a borrowed suit slightly too large. At the shoulders, shaking hands with everyone who looked wealthy, telling each group he was a man of enormous regional importance. The evening was magnificent. Long tables and white cloth, candlelight, important people in beautiful clothes, laughing and talking. Bernard was in the middle of an embellished story about his influence when every conversation in the room stopped at exactly the same moment. A man walked onto the stage, tall, a perfectly fitted dark suit, shoes polished like mirrors. He moved with the hurried, unshakable calm of someone who had nothing left to prove to any room he walked into. Bernard squinted from across the hall. Something was familiar. The jaw, the hands, the quiet way his eyes moved slowly across the room until they found exactly one face. They found Grace, and Grace looked at her husband Desmond standing on that stage in that suit and felt the entire world tilt completely and permanently sideways. The host announced him as the founder and owner of the company. A billionaire who had built everything quietly, who traveled without announcement, who chose to live among ordinary people because he genuinely believed it was the only honest way to understand what the world truly needed. Bernard's borrowed suit felt like it was slowly strangling him. Every joke about the poor watchman came back at once. Every cruel word about the useless girl. The man he had dismissed was standing before hundreds of powerful people, and the girl he had traded away without a second thought was seated at the main table as his wife. The woman the entire evening was partially organized to honor. Desmond announced that the hotel project was cancelled permanently. In its place, the company would fund a fully protected medicinal garden and a modern medical center on the hills, saving the surrounding communities for generations. Then he said her name clearly publicly. He told every person in that room that it was a young woman from the village armed with nothing but notebooks, courage, and years of quiet dedication who had changed the direction of the entire project. Grace had tears running freely down her face, but she was smiling. Afterward, when the hole had emptied and they were finally alone, Grace looked at Desmond for a long time. "You lied to me," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was something more complicated than anger. Desmond did not flinch. "I did," he said quietly. "And I am truly sorry. I needed to know who you were before you knew who I was. I needed to see your real heart, not the version people perform when they think something is being offered. And when you fell sick," she said slowly, "was that real?" A small honest pause. "No," he said softly. "It was not. But watching you work 2 shifts in the deck to buy medicine for a man you did not even choose. Grace, that was the realest thing I have ever witnessed in my life." She was quiet. "I need time," she said simply. "Take all of it," he said. "I am not going anywhere." It took time. Real time. But Desmond gave her exactly what he had promised. Time. Patience. Presence. He enrolled her in the finest medical school in the country. He sat beside her on the nights she could not sleep, both of them reading in comfortable silence the same way they had in the small house with a leaking roof. He drove to her hospital on the hardest days just to leave a warm meal at the nurse's station with her name on it signed simply. "I am proud of you." Bernard came to their door one quiet evening, had in both hands, looking older and smaller than Grace had ever seen him. "I was wrong," he said. "About you, about everything. I am sorry, Grace." Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped aside. Not because the wound was small. It was not, but because she had learned from a pale flower growing between 2 ancient trees that the most powerful things do not survive by holding themselves closed forever. They survive by choosing again and again to open. Years passed. The medical center opened on the hills where the silver bloom still grew, carefully protected and quietly blooming through every season. Patients traveled from distant places. Researchers came to study. Students came to learn. And the doctor who led it all, the one whose name traveled the world on the covers of medical journals, was Grace. The same girl who had once been told she was useless. The same girl who had worked double shifts in the dark and cried quietly on a bus where no one could see her. The same girl who had looked at a small pale flower growing where no one else bothered to look and decided without anyone's permission that it mattered. She had been right. She had always been right. And that, dear viewer, is what I want you to hold on to today. The people who tell you that you are nothing, usually the ones standing on the very ground that will one day carry your name. Your dream is not too big. Your heart is not too small. And the things you have been quietly building in the deck, the things no one has praised or noticed or believed in, those are 18 minutes, 25 seconds. Exactly the things the world is waiting for. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Drop a heart and tell us where you're watching.